Support for this episode comes from Embark. At Embark, interfaith couples in their 20s and 30s explore Judaism together without pressure to convert. No expectations, no right answers, just empowering couples to build a life that's right for them. Each cohort is 6 rabbi-led sessions and a weekend retreat, exploring topics like designing your own rituals, belonging, and more, alongside other couples asking the same questions. Head to memglobal.com/embark to find upcoming cohorts near you, including a virtual cohort beginning July 13th. Again, that's memglobal, memglobal.com/embark. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 537, Trans Jews Embody Holiness. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg.
And I'm Rena Yehuda Newman.
And today we're thrilled to welcome Dubs Weinblatt, a longtime educator and facilitator whose work focuses on LGBTQIA+ inclusion and belonging. This episode continues a mini-series that we began a few weeks ago with Samira Mehta, exploring the topic of bodily autonomy through Jewish lenses. The topic of reproductive justice, which we explored with Samira Mehta, is one that often comes to mind when the phrase bodily autonomy is used. But advocacy for the rights and the empowerment of transgender people is not always part of that bodily autonomy conversation. Today, we're going to explore the ways in which justice for trans folks is an integral part of the conversation about bodily autonomy for all people. Before we dive in, a couple quick Judaism Unbouncements. First, we currently have applications open for our 4th cohort in the Unyeshiva's certificate program for Unbound Judaism. We would love for you to head to judaismunbound.com/certificate and learn more. This is an incredible, immersive, digital opportunity to connect with people all around the country and the world. You get to connect with folks via Zoom on a monthly basis, take our courses, cap it all off with an incredible capstone project. This has become one of the crown jewels of Judaism Unbound's work, and we hope that you'll consider applying for it. Again, you can do so by heading to judaismunbound.com/certificate, filling out the quick info form, and then you'll receive an email with all of the application materials that you need. Also, if you're interested in supporting Judaism Unbound's work financially, we are so grateful to you if you do so. You can head to judaismunbound.com/donate, and every gift, whether it's $1, $5, $18, $100, $1,000, $1 million, it means the world to us and allows us to keep this work going. We are fresh off of Shavuot Live, our biggest event of the year, where it's such an amazing thing to see all of our community come together. We want to make events like that happen more. We want to make this podcast continue. We want to keep releasing new podcasts in our family of podcasts. So help us continue this work by heading to judaismunbound.com/donate and making either a monthly recurring gift or a one-time donation. And now a bit more about today's guest. Dubs Weinblatt grew up in Columbus, Ohio in the 80s and 90s, where access to positive queer and trans Jewish representation was hard to come by. In 2015, Weinblatt founded Thank You for Coming Out, which started as a queer improv show and quickly grew into a community that centers, uplifts, and explores queer identity in all of its facets. Dubs Weinblatt and their team began performing all over the country and eventually started teaching improv and storytelling workshops. They went on to host and produce a podcast also called Thank You for Coming Out, produced by Gay City News. In 2017, Weinblatt joined Keshet, a national Jewish nonprofit working with Jewish institutions on LGBTQ equality. They joined as a program associate and rose to become their associate director of education and training. Recently, Dubs Weinblatt joined the staff team at SAJ, Judaism That Stands for All, as social justice manager. Dubs Weinblatt is a recipient of GCN Impact Awards, was named one of Logo's New Now Next 6 Inspiring LGBTQ Jewish Activists You Should Be Following, was named one of Jewish Week's 36 Under 36, and they are part of the ROI community. Dubs Weinblatt, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. I'm honored.
So for this purpose of this conversation, how do you think we should define bodily autonomy? And is there something that's Jewish about this framework, especially when we're talking about how trans rights are maybe more than just trans people's freedom?
To me, bodily autonomy is having control over your own body and getting to make the choices that are right for you. For one, to be able to live happily and affirmed. I remember maybe 9-10 years ago. So I had just had top surgery, which is a double mastectomy for folks who don't know. And I was in this like conflict of if I was made in the image of God, B'Tselem Elohim, and this idea of God doesn't make mistakes, but also why then am I needing to change my body? And so I had a lot of like internal conflict around that. And I think what I came down to is for me, like I was put on this earth to go through what I went through to become who I am. So like part of how God or the divine or the path or whatever made me was to understand who I was in a deeper way, which meant I needed to make some adjustments to feel whole. Bodily autonomy is doing what you need to do to feel whole. And in terms of the current regime, I think people are afraid of power, meaning, trans people spend a lot of time and energy getting to know oneself and how it relates to white supremacy, the gender binary, all of these systems and powers that keep people in line. So they follow, so they don't kind of rock the boat. And so when trans people are exploring and celebrating who they are outside of that kind of like, this is cookie cutter how you're supposed to be, that's scary because that shows power and that shows that we are thinking outside the box, or thinking outside the binary, or thinking outside of how they want us to be living.
So I want to situate us in connection with a recent conversation we had with Samira Mehta about her book, God Bless the Pill. And for those who didn't listen to that one, we'll put it in the show notes for this episode. This framework of bodily autonomy is super important. And I don't know that it's obvious to everyone why we would be in a conversation focusing on bodily autonomy of trans folks in a unit that started with a conversation about reproductive healthcare, reproductive justice specifically. And as we were putting this together, it felt really important to us to use a framework around bodily autonomy, which I think tends to trigger thoughts in people's minds about abortion, about what is talked about as a women's issue, which it isn't exclusively a women's issue. And so I wanted to ask you, when we talk about bodily autonomy, generally, Jewishly otherwise, like, what are we talking about? And why is it important that we understand that this isn't just a conversation about cisgender women, but also a conversation about trans folks and their reproduction, but also beyond that?
Even going beyond reproductive rights, I want to take a step back and think about the people who, of all genders, let's say they cut and dye their hair. I'm just thinking very superficially, or have plastic surgery, so like Botox or a nose job or cheek implants or whatever they are. I say superficial, but actually for a lot of people, those things are crucial to feel affirmed in their body and to feel whole. And so if we kind of zoom back to where we're talking about bodily autonomy around reproductive rights and being able to feel like oneself, I'll give a personal example, which is I am assigned female at birth. So I grew up being told I was a woman, even though I knew inside and innately, instinctually, that was not who I am. But I still went through a puberty that caused menstruation and breast growth and all of these, for some people, really exciting life changes. And for me, they were not so exciting. They were devastating. And to be able to have the opportunity to make adjustments to feel more at home in my body. A couple of years ago, I was kind of in this decision point where I had been on testosterone for a bunch of years and I had stopped menstruating, which for me really was life-saving and life-affirming. And I worried that if Trump got elected again and he took away trans healthcare, which would include hormone replacement therapy, HRT, that I would start menstruating again. And for me, I cannot be present for that. And I'm so happy for people who like to menstruate. And I'm so happy for people who want to menstruate, who get to. I always like to bring that caveat in. So I made a decision to have a full hysterectomy. And so it was kind of like a proactive move on my part of, if God forbid I lose access to hormone replacement therapy, I won't have the body parts that would have me menstruate. And so I was lucky to have a doctor who understood that, was a trans affirming OBGYN And so there was no explaining on my part. There was no negotiating or kind of hiding the real reason behind the reason. She just understood it from the get-go, which is rare. So I had this huge surgery, which I know for a lot of people cannot even fathom that I would have this huge surgery just in case. But I think it also illustrates the utmost urgency for people to have control over their own bodies.
Dubs, I really relate to this piece of it, which is seeing the direction that things are going, especially under this current regime, and frankly, even further back, and being worried about not just the future in a broad general sense, but the future in an embodied sense. About really like, what does this mean for my physical body that this ideology is now installed? Part of the reason why I ended up moving to New York was actually about being in a place that was going to be a lot more culturally protected. And I hear you talking about what is gender affirming care. It's not just for trans people, right? HRT, hormone replacement therapy, I mean, originally designed for cisgender folks, right? And how much easier it is for cisgender people to have access to the hormones that make them feel like them, but how much harder it is for trans people to have access to the hormones that make us feel like us. And when I think also about bodily autonomy in terms of presentation in the world, I'm also thinking about the freedom to wear a yarmulke. I'm thinking about all the debates that I've seen on Islamophobic bases about who's allowed to wear hijab.
Both gender related,
Highly. Right. And when we think about the intersection of gender and bodily autonomy, we're not just talking about cisgender women's reproductive rights. It's a great bouncing off point, but it affects so many people in so many different ways. Dub, something that I heard you say is, well, just because this is the way for me does not mean that I'm saying, oh, it's bad to be this other thing or nobody should feel this way. Actually, gender diversity is a part of this Jewish mentality of let 1,000 blossoms bloom. I really believe that gender is this sacred, holy experience. But I'm interested in talking a little bit about how transphobia and anti-Semitism have actually historically been intertwined. Jews have often been seen as gender nonconforming in the environments that they're in Christian hegemony. There are stereotypes about menstruating men, right, which to me just sounds a lot like some trans men, right? That there's a lot of these stereotypes about Jews as being gender nonconforming. And so I'm kind of wondering if, knowing this history, are there ways that Jewish communities, broadly speaking, cis or trans or somewhere in between, that Jews can act as bulwarks to protect trans folks in potentially unique ways?
I mean, I think what keeps coming back to me is just B'Tselem Elohim, like made in the image of the divine. Over and over, it's what I hold on to. And I host my own podcast and I talk a lot about like I want people to know that I'm trans. Like I just am excited about like because I've worked so hard that I'm like I want everyone to know. Similarly with my Judaism, of just like I want everyone to know. And with the current regime, we just, you're talking about right now, just our current state. And there are times when I want to hide both my queerness and my Judaism. It's that mental math for a lot of us around religion and around gender of like, where and when am I safe? And I think there's a lot tied up into, of course, with the anti-Semitism and transphobia around people who, because Christian hegemony is the overarching idea in this country, that anything that falls outside of that framework is viewed as quote unquote other. And so I think of Jewish, I think of trans, I think of Muslim, I think of, all of these, other ways of existing is scary to people.
Let's keep rocking with some of these threads. I mean, I'm particularly interested in a how question. How we, for me, it's a given, and for our show, it's a given that we want Jewish communities to be part of the struggle in support of trans folks, trans rights, in a moment where those rights are under assault by our own government, by so many in our society. To me, that's a given. So the how question is how we do that. And in particular, a how question arises around how we do it Jewishly. And this feels like a good moment. I mean, I'm grateful for you bringing up B'Tselem Elohim, for bringing up like this idea of all human beings in the image of God. I think there's some tensions to explore there. And we've talked in the past with Raphael Nice, about some historic shadow sides of B'Tselem Elohim. We don't have to go into all the details there, but I'm interested in how we sometimes use sort of ancient Jewish precedent, a phrase, B'Tselem Elohim, from the book of Genesis, from like the very beginning of our Jewish story. And one way to fight in support of trans folks through Jewish lenses is to look to those ancient precedents and say, look at how this value that's very storied, very ancient, can be mobilized in support of people who are under attack. Another is to look at more recent kinds of historic parallels. And I think we've started to hint at this, but it's really clear when we look at the last couple hundred years of history, which in the Jewish story is very recent, that certain groups get used as the paradigmatic other in society. And most commonly, Jews have been used that way in a lot of European societies and even in other areas of the world. Jews are a way that non-Jews understand those who are different from them. And I think today that's still true. Christian societies, including our own, I don't like talking about the US as a Christian society. It claims to be other things, but the way that we are walking and being in the world right now is in fact that many people are articulating us as a Christian society. And that society continues to use Jew as stand-in for the other. But also increasingly, that same society uses trans folks as the paradigmatic other. It's so harmful, it's so hateful towards trans folks, and it implies that to be different is not awesome. Like, part of my struggle with, like, I actually want to sort of be like, Jews are really different. We're not the same as everyone, and that's great. And same with, like, yeah, there are people that to a cisgender person might not feel as relatable because they haven't lived that life experience. But like, yalla, let's go. That's awesome. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, how can we start to understand the ways in which we have deeply stigmatized otherness, and the way we've done that is specifically dangerous to trans folks in 2026 and specifically dangerous to Jewish folks in 2026?
I mean, the first image that came to my mind is the Holocaust. When a society unites around a quote unquote common enemy, it's so dangerous. And we are not a threat, but people rally around the idea that Jews and or trans people or queer people are threats. There's an idea that Jews have all of this power. And I think when trans people, kind of harkening back to what we were talking about earlier, trans people have a lot of power because we are understanding ourselves in a society that doesn't want us to exist. And we are pursuing ourselves in a way that people aren't used to. And that shows a lot of power. And so I think people are afraid of this power and or perceived power of, Jews have all this power, queer people have all this power, and that's threatening to what they assume is power. And by they, I mean fascist regimes. And because they are afraid of losing their power, they're doing everything they can to rev up the otherness of Jewish people and queer people. They do that by spreading hate, by spreading lies, by spreading propaganda. How can we keep these people down? How do we villainize them? How do we make sure that they don't inspire other people? There actually is a lot of power in, I've been out and talking about my queerness for decades. And I get people all the time telling me, like, you inspired me to be myself in XYZ way. Because there actually is power in giving people permission to be themselves. And that's scary to people who want to keep us contained.
That feels right on the money. This question of who is a threat and these really amorphous ideas about who has power. And it's interesting too, because it's like when I think about trans people in this political environment, it's like we're sort of systematically disempowered. We have visibility. Right? Back in March every year, there is Trans Day of Visibility. It's one of two official, quote unquote, holidays on the trans calendar year. There's Trans Day of Visibility and Trans Day of And every year I find in my communities that there's a lot of discourse about, well, I don't know that these are great holidays. I ended up making a document called the Trans Calendar, where every day is a different holiday, and we can put that in the show notes. But part of the reason for creating a calendar like this, and part of the actual power that trans folks have, is exactly what you're saying. It's a cultural power. And when I'm thinking also historically about Jews as a minority that's often the structure of anti-Semitism is about Jews having a disproportionate amount of power. It's not that Jews are subhuman, it's that Jews are superhuman in a way that creates these conspiracy theories and is thought to be quote unquote dangerous. Trans people are right now a flashpoint for this topic of bodily autonomy writ large because of exactly what you said. We demonstrate that another world is possible and that one can truly know themselves outside of the structures that say we're supposed to act a certain way. Trans people say, actually, we can decide for ourselves what the spiritual, social value is of our experience in the world. And so I want to talk about the real Jewish and trans intersection of this quote unquote power of the other. When you brought up the Holocaust, immediately what came to mind is Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexology. Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexology was this amazing school, this amazing institute that was studying gender nonconformity. But when I think about Magnus Hirschfeld, so much of what was threatening about the Institute for Sexology was exactly the thing that we're seeing now as trans rights being threatening to Christian hegemony and white nationalism in the United States. And as we enter into this moment, we're often taught to believe that, oh, transness is this new phenomenon. It's not. These things were erased. One of the most classic pictures of Nazi book burning is actually the burning of the Hirschfeld Institute for Sexology's archives. And it feels really important right now from the Judaism Unbound perch that we have as we're podcasting out about these things to the Jewish world, that I want fellow Jews to really understand the historical intersection of transphobia and anti-Semitism. Magnus Hirschfeld was a Jewish man. And so I'm thinking now about a really beautiful piece of Torah that I got from Joy Layden, who's a friend and mentor, who really likes talking about what do we learn about ourselves from looking at God? And what do we learn about God from looking at ourselves? I think I want to talk a little bit about the holiness aspect of this. What is holy about the experience of being trans or the experience of being Jewish and fighting a power that says that we shouldn't be the things that we are?
I love that so much. I worked at Keshet for 5 years. Keshet is a Hebrew word that means rainbow. It's a national organization that works with Jewish institutions on LGBTQ inclusion. And I remember as I was kind of finding my footing, the first maybe year that I taught there, I cried in every room I was in because I was so overwhelmed by the idea that these Jewish professionals cared enough about queer people that they were in this room to learn how to create places of belonging. Because growing up, I never saw that implicitly or explicitly in any of my Jewish spaces. So there was a little bit of imposter syndrome, at least in the beginning of trying to fit in. And so when I was in this room, I said something along the lines of, I used to think queerness was the thing that separated me from my community. And now I realize it's my superpower. To me, that's so holy. That is so incredible. The idea of being embraced as a queer person, as a Jewish person, as a queer Jew is something I never could have imagined. The other piece of it for me of the divine and holiness is what queer and trans people have to undo to find ourselves is not for the faint of heart. It is going against every single system and structure that is put into place to keep us in line. And so it really takes a lot of push and struggle and trying to figure out who we are. And I feel there's nothing more holy than that, of that struggle. We talk about struggling a lot in Judaism and, finding our place.
Which, just to fill in the gap, they're struggling because of the name Yisrael, Jacob's renamed name in Genesis is struggling with God.
Yes, thank you. And the way that I think about a divine presence isn't complacency. It isn't just go with it. It's no, build the world you want to see and fight for the things that are right and that are important. The other last piece that I'll say is that I think the struggle that a lot of trans people have gone through to find ourselves and to exist in the world also ties into, Rena Yehuda, what you were talking about with transnative visibility. What is visibility without safety? And I think the people like of my generation, I'm 41 and older and maybe slightly younger, like we've pushed through so hard, so wonderfully that people are afraid. The hope of Keshet, the hope of me as an educator, as a trans person, I think for a lot of people is that younger generations of trans folks don't have to struggle as much as we did because we're going to be building holy space for people to feel like they can show up as they are and not have to go through the kind of undoing that I had to go through.
Yes. I really like this angle, the set of angles on holiness. I want to talk more about it. One of my personally cherished Jewish practices, min hagim, I have certain practices in my prayer practice and otherwise where I change something that, to my knowledge, not a lot of people change, but is very important. Like, I think people believe what's special about being Jewish is being part of a bunch of traditions and customs that date back thousands of years. I like that. I do a lot of it. I also like having a few little practices that are like, I decided to rebel Jewishly. One of them is around the word holy in Hebrew, kadosh. There's this big moment that a lot of people, it's one of their most memorable moments in the prayer service because it has choreography with it. You say kadosh, kadosh, kadosh. You say it 3 times. Holy, holy, holy. And people go on their tiptoes 3 times. And the idea there is that they are getting on their tiptoes with the word kadosh to sort of be embodying a closeness to God. And the idea physically there is that God is above. And I don't think God is exclusively above. It's not my theology. It's not what I understand as where divineness dwells. And not only do I think that's sort of not right, I think it is deeply harmful to inhabit a world where we think holiness is sort of far from us, external. There's that famous idea that Jews do know of like, no. Torah is not far away from you. It's not across the sea. It's not in the heavens. That's in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, I understand people listening might do that practice. I'm not saying you're evil. I'm not saying you're bad. I turn my body to all direct. I do actually on the first kadosh go on my tiptoes. But then for the other kadoshim, I turn my body to all sides and also like bow downward. Because I am signifying with my body that where holiness dwells is not only some sort of external deity above that I'm praying to, but all of us in the room. I don't think me doing that is counter-Jewish, even though it is counter a particular Jewish custom. I actually believe I'm doing that from a grounded, rooted Jewish place. But it's an individual choice I'm making that I'm calling Jewish without anybody else validating me, really. Like, I feel licensed to do that. And I think that links to the conversation we're having about bodily autonomy. We've touched on wearing a yarmulke. We've touched on getting surgeries that affect your body. We've touched on estrogen, HRT. Like, all of these are part of a broader conversation about us being able to name how we want to be and then being it. I don't think we talk enough about how Judaism does that. We have magic in our rituals all the time. Like, we say words, we cast spells basically with our mouths. And we transform food from being not allowed to being allowed. We have Havdalah at the end of Shabbat, where through our words, we actually change the status of the universe from being Shabbat to not being Shabbat. It is actually our words that do that. If we don't say those words, there are arguments in the Talmud that Havdalah, that Shabbat is still going. So, like, we have magical powers. We have many characters in our Torah who pick their own names. And given that we're talking about a community of people who often pick their own names, I guess I just want to hear from you a little bit more about that power word that came up before. How can we channel these powers together? There's an individual axis of sort of individual bodily autonomy, and then there's the collective. What does it look like when rooms full of people, trans, cis, and otherwise, Jews and otherwise, channel this energy around bodily autonomy and bring it to a world that needs it?
I mean, the first thing that came to mind is world changing. Of if we were all in a room together and everyone deeply understood that everyone deserves to like have control over their own bodies, whatever that looks like, and that what I choose to do to my body has literally zero impact on anybody else. And if we all like deeply understood that, like unstoppable, that would be an unstoppable force for people to really truly understand No, like I get to decide for myself. And I think there are a lot of people who right now are afraid to go against the grain or to go against, the majority, or what we feel is the majority. It's actually just a very loud minority. But I think if we could all rally around this idea of let them, we'd be in a very different place.
Dubs, I just heard you say it would be better if everyone understood that me doing what I need to do for myself has zero impact on everyone else. It's like that's 100%. That's 100% true, and also it has infinite impact. And
Yeah.
that feels like that's the ikar. That's the exact essence of the thing that you're saying, which is all of us as individuals to feel empowered to do exactly what we need to do has this unbelievable echo effect where everybody sees the power of someone being truly in themselves. We talked earlier in the episode about what does it mean to wrestle and how Yisrael literally means to struggle with God. If that's struggling with God, then all trans people are tzaddiks. And this feels also like a pretty important paradigm shift because when we talk about minorities, when we talk about marginalization, it's often with this element of like, oh, these poor people, they suffer so much at the edges. Let's bring them inside. If you're cold, they're cold, right? Let's bring them inside. In fact, actually, it's the inverse of usually it is the people who are the most at the margins who have the greatest Torah. It is in exile that we experience revelation, every descent for the sake of ascent, that it's actually in the deepest or most painful or below, under the surface places that the greatest Torah is revealed and the greatest holiness can happen. I love the fact that Jew is a gender neutral term, frankly. And I think that there are a lot of ways that my ability to be out and proud or my experience of my transness as not a status that, oh, it makes me different than other people in a way that's bad or makes me vulnerable. And it's like, and it certainly does make me vulnerable. It makes me much more vulnerable in the world, but that's not because that's intrinsic to being trans. That's because of the power structures that are in place. I want to talk a little bit about my experience growing up as a trans kid at my synagogue. And me and a lot of the other kids in my Beit Sefer class and my Hebrew school class ended up coming out as trans. And it was actually in the synagogue context that I was more protected. That there were adults, many of whom were queer adults, who really wanted to protect the ways that me and my friends were trying to figure out who we were. Dubs, you spoke about how much, this generation of trans folks who are now in our late 20s, 30s, 40s, and then trans people who are in the generation above that and on, we work really hard to try to protect trans youth. And now with the kinds of laws and restrictions that we're seeing by this current administration, limiting and eliminating in some cases gender affirming care for youth, it's a really, really safe, tried and true method of preserving the mental health of young trans kids as they're figuring out who they are before adulthood. And we're seeing those services being eliminated. I feel so much sadness and fear about the ways that I'm not able to protect the trans youth right now who are coming of age in a world that believes that it hates them. I feel so grateful to my youth educators and to my synagogue and my Jewish communities that really protected me when I was so green and fragile in my young experiences as a gender nonconforming kid. And I've been gender nonconforming since I was really, really little. And I really want this to also be a call to all of our listeners, whether you are a part of a synagogue community, whether you are doing Judaism on your own terms elsewhere in smaller pockets of the diaspora. What are the ways that your community can actually act as, what we're often calling these days a safe space, but I'm just going to say as a protected environment for trans youth who feel like there's nowhere to turn. In fact, being able to nurture the well-being and the spiritual gendered experiences of our kids is so important. And I really believe that Jewish communities can play such a great role in that. Dubs, you've got a whole career doing all kinds of incredible DEI work and really talking about the nuts and bolts of inclusion. For our listeners who do all kinds of Jewish organizing or really make Jewish life where they are, wherever they are, what basic pieces of advice do you think you can give to help our listeners protect not just the trans adults in their community, but specifically the trans children?
Yeah. The first kind of value that's coming to mind is kavod, or respect, and respecting people for who they are. And I see a lot of assumptions being made oh, this person has long hair, must be a girl, must use she, her pronouns, right? And so kind of separating our beliefs, how we've all been kind of socialized to think about gender presentation and being like, I'm not going to make any assumptions. Why don't you tell me who you are? I'm also thinking about in an educational setting, like who are our sources? What voices are we bringing into the classroom and how can we diversify those? Because Rena Yehuda, you were talking about our history being erased. So for me, like growing up, I never knew queer Jews existed, either in our tradition or otherwise. And that was really isolating for me. And so the more that we can lift up queerness within a Jewish setting as a natural, normal part of our tradition, the safer it becomes for kids and grown-ups to say, oh, I actually do belong in this space because I'm not the only one. I feel like for me, and generally, like queerness is a space of exploration. And so it's hard to explore when there's a lot of restrictions on, well, you said your name was this yesterday. You said your pronouns were this yesterday. How could it possibly have changed from day to day? The nutrients of queerness is like being able to try things on and seeing what grows and giving space for that.
Yeah, I mean, we're arcing towards the close of this episode, and there's a tension because I feel called to bring up the ways that this conversation is deeply important for the benefit of cisgender people as well. I don't want that to be the core, though. Like there's like this, but like fundamentally, trans people's rights are not for the purpose of anybody else. And I am a cisgender person who I believe has benefited immensely in my own ritual life, in my own spiritual experience from, I don't want to call them innovations or interventions, but like ritual creativity on the basis of recognizing people who are trans. The notion of calling people up to the Torah historically has been done through saying their Jewish name and then ben or bat, son of or daughter of their parents' names, or historically just their father's name in some communities. There's been ritual creativity around that where it is now not uncommon in many communities to call up people with insert name, mibet, their parents' names, which mibet means from the house of. It's a gender neutral formulation. It's a way of being able to call up people who are non-binary without asserting them as either male or female in the Hebrew language. And for me, like I'm a cisgender man. That's who I am. I have some gender nonconforming elements of who I am. I wear a lot of bright colors. There's a lot of pink, and I feel like I'm a cisgender man. And I like me bait. I like being called up from the house of, not because I feel like it's inaccurate to call me son of, to call me Ben, Lior Ben Pesach Kiva Verachel, or like that's not inaccurate for me. For other people, it would be inaccurate, and that's why that creativity was mobilized. But for me, there's something intimate about like I'm from the house of Peter and Ruth. Like I grew up in their house. Like that is true. That phrase means both from the literal house of and like from the capital H house, like from the family of. I like that double entendre. I think it gives kavod, it gives honor to my parents. And for me, saying son of, it's not that that is the opposite, but it's like a little not quite as good. So this is a case where, for the sake of trans people, we came up with a ritual innovation that I'm really grateful for in additional ways. So in a non-patronizing, non-condescending way, not to decenter trans folks, like how is this conversation not just about trans people being able to have their full autonomy, but actually all of us too?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. And it also ties beautifully, which you probably did on purpose, to like the advice for folks to create affirming spaces, which is this idea of universal design, where when we create things to assist folks who need maybe a little extra help, we actually are helping everybody. So you're saying this innovation for trans people to feel a sense of belonging in the synagogue of being called to Torah makes you, a cisgender man, also feel more affirmed. And so I'm also thinking about folks who maybe don't have a mom and a dad, but then feeling forced into, oh, but I'm like the son of or the daughter of these two people, but I have two moms, or I only was raised by a dad, or I have three parents, like whatever it might be. when we expand, we're creating room for everybody. And I'm thinking about restrooms, right? Where we have historically a men's room and a women's room. And that could be a whole other podcast episode. But when we have all gender restrooms, we're then now creating space for someone to go into the restroom with their assistant or their nurse, or like helping, a family member who has a walker or a child, right? So we're actually creating room for everybody when we center trans people. When we fight for the rights of the most marginalized, it actually creates freedom and liberation for everybody. And I think it's like a perfect example, way to position when we're talking about transness and how it impacts and affects everybody.
And it feels really worth pointing out, Dubs, what you just said, that when we expand these things, it's great for everybody, because it turns out when we're being thoughtful about what are the needs of everybody in the room, it just means there's more for all of us. Those who are running an authoritarian or a fascist regime, they know that. And that's why trans people have been the flashpoint. That's why Jews have been the flashpoint. Because these symbolic others are actually stand-ins for everybody else's rights. If someone is not free to transition, you better believe that cisgender women are not free to have access to abortion or the pill. You better believe that cisgender men are not allowed to be emotional, are not allowed to be gentle. And all of those things serve the current regime. And so too with Jews, in talking about religious freedom and different kinds of practices or spiritual experiences. All of these things are fundamentally against a hegemonic regime that does not want people to be different and does not want people to be empowered. And so singling out minorities that are stand-ins for those things erode the rights of everyone else, but keeping usually other people who are not a part of those categories saying, well, it's just this 1% of people. It's nope, it affects all of us. But understanding what you're saying is how interconnected all of us are. And I really, really want to invoke to our listeners how much our Jewish communities can actually be strongholds in weathering the storm of authoritarianism, how much we can protect our youth, how much we can protect each other, but also being in the Jewish communities that we are, we're connected with other people who can help us survive these moments. We have Jewish ideas that have helped Jewish communities survive authoritarian regimes, and we can do that for all other minority groups who we are inextricably connected to. When we're looking at how bad the world is, I feel very grateful for the potential of Jewish community to protect Black and brown Jews and non-Jews, to protect immigrants, to protect trans people, to protect disabled people, right? All of these structures are about saying there's only one kind of desirable person, and we know that that is a lie. And that's the best advantage that we have as Jews, is the joy that we know of a world in which there are more people who are different from each other, that's the way to Olam Haba. That's the way to the world to come.
Yeah, I'm sitting here with so much gratitude, and that really resonated. And just the chutzpah, the audacity for people to live their truths in a world that doesn't want us to, is phenomenal. Lex, I actually had a question for you when you were describing your practice around Kadosh, 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 and how you've kind of adapted your own practice. And I'm curious, in doing that, I've never seen anyone do that before. How does that feel to kind of go against the grain in a room where people are assuming that that this is what it should look like, that we should be, up on our toes 3 times, but you're doing something different? And how does that feel for you? And has anyone ever said anything to you? Because I think it also addresses kind of like a larger question here of like, what does it feel like when you go against the grain in a room where everyone's expecting you to be a certain way or do a certain thing? Trans people are always going against the grain just by existing. And so I think if we tie together what it feels like, that can also help unite us even more strongly of like, okay, you also were a stranger, right? Like, what it feels like. So Lex, what does, like, I'd love to just learn a little bit more about that.
Super happy to. I'll be brief, and then you'll get the final note of this episode. But it feels really good. I don't know that it would feel very good for everybody, but I feel really good when I do things in a room for prayer that are actively different from that room. I will say I'm also a person who walks around the world wearing a yarmulke every day in Providence, Rhode Island, and I've lived in Jackson, Mississippi, where I wore a yarmulke every day. Like, I clearly get something out of it. It juices me up to be different from the space I'm in. But like, it's also why I like being Jewish, by the way. I grew up in a environment that was deeply Protestant Christian, and I think part of why I wanted to be so deep in Jewish life was that it made me interesting compared to the rest of the room. It made me different. And so in my prayer practice, I have a number of things. It's not just this, but I believe in a Jewish world, like I said before, where everybody would have some of these sacred rituals that are sacred not because they are shared by all Jews, but because you in your neshama, you in your soul have decided that for a particular reason, you're called to them. Very few people comment about it, to get to that part of your question. Like, I haven't had that many people come up to me at the end of services. I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. Part of it is like it happens early on and then a lot of time passes and like people are just going to kiddush lunch or whatever. We also don't have a communal norm of talking about our prayer practices. I don't think people like sit next to each other at kiddush and be like, what do you do during the Amidah? What do you do at Kadosh Kadosh? Like, I would love that. I've been in certain spaces. I was part of this Jews in the Woods community in college where there was sort of a pride in praying differently from one another and with one another, where that was probably the one space I've ever been a part of where that was kind of normal to be like, oh, which melodies do you use? How do you stand? Like, what do you wear? What, like, so maybe we got to do more of that, but I'll leave it at that and turn it back to you. My answer is that I thrive in spaces that allow me to be a little bit weird. As we close, what's kind of a charge you've got for our listeners as they're doing whatever they're doing, like driving their car, cooking in the kitchen with their cell phone, playing the podcast? What should they be thinking about as they head into the rest of their day?
So many things. Thank you for sharing that, Lex. It's something what you just said, and it's just it's lighting up my soul of like, I want to be in spaces where I can be weird and feel loved and a sense of belonging. And some of that has to do with, who I am as a trans person. Some of it has to do with who I am as a Jew. But like, to be able to be in a space where you can, often when I teach, I talk about this proverbial backpack that you put on every day when you move through the world, and there are microaggressions and there are slights towards you, either as a queer person, as a trans person, as a Jew, people asking inappropriate questions or making assumptions about you. It's like adding a brick to the backpack, and it gets heavier and heavier as the day goes on. And that makes it harder for people who have the backpack to be silly and funny and themselves because they're holding so much weight. My hope, my charge, my request is that we can create space where people can feel safe to take off the backpack and just exist and feel held and be able to be silly. To me, that's like the holiest thing, is to be able to be yourself.
Amen. Thank you so much, Stubbs Weinblatt, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you. Thank you both so much.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As a reminder, as we close, our Unyeshiva certificate program in Unbound Judaism has applications open for its 4th cohort. You can head to judaismunbound.com/certificate to apply. On that page, you can fill out a quick info form, and then you'll be emailed all the materials you need to apply. The deadline is coming up, so don't wait. Head to judaismunbound.com/certificate. I almost said don't wait. Head to judaismunbound.com/certificate, but that felt a little too corny even for me, and so I'm placing it in parentheses afterwards like this. Anywho, another quick note. Our Discord server is growing by leaps and bounds. At our recent Shavuot live event, we had many dozens of people join in just 24 hours, and so our member count is now over 430. Head to discord.judaismunbound.com if you want to be able to interact asynchronously with Judaism Unbounders all around the country, all around the world. We would love for you to participate in our many, many channels about Jewish history, about art, about pictures of your cats, whatever you've got. There is a channel in our Discord to explore it, so head to discord.judaismunbound.com. A few ways that you can be in touch with us. First, you can head to our Facebook or Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. You can send us messages there. You can go to our website, judaismunbound.com, to find show notes for this episode and all sorts of other juicy goodies. You can email us at hosts, HOSTS, at judaismunbound.com. We'll respond to any questions you have, visions you have for the Jewish future, comments on this episode. There, it will go to both me and Rini Yehuda. And we are so grateful if you are interested in supporting us financially, which you can do by heading to judaismunbound.com/donate and giving a gift either on a one-time basis or as a recurring monthly donation. So thank you so much for listening. We hope you'll continue on with us into future episodes exploring bodily autonomy in the coming weeks. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.